Section 13 of Orlando by Virginia Woolf. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Corrie Samuel. Chapter 5, Part 1. The great cloud which hung, not only over London, but over the whole of the British Isles on the first day of the 19th century, stayed, or rather did not stay, for it was buffeted about constantly by blustering gales, long enough to have extraordinary consequences upon those who lived beneath its shadow. A change seemed to have come over the climate of England. Rain fell frequently, but only in fitful gusts, which were no sooner over than they began again. The sun shone, of course, but it was so girt about with clouds, and the air was so saturated with water, that its beams were discoloured, and purples, oranges, and reds of a dull sort took the place of the more positive landscapes of the 18th century. Under this bruised and sullen canopy, the green of the cabbages was less intense, and the white of the snow was muddied. But what was worse, damp now began to make its way into every house, damp, which is the most insidious of all enemies, for while the sun can be shut out by blinds, and the frost roasted by a hot fire, damp steals in while we sleep. Damp is silent, imperceptible, ubiquitous. Damp swells the wood, furs the kettle, rusts the iron, rots the stone. So gradual is the process, that it is not until we pick up some chest of drawers or coal scuttle, and the whole thing drops to pieces in our hands, that we suspect even that the disease is at work. Thus, stealthily and imperceptibly, none marking the exact day or hour of the change, the constitution of England was altered, and nobody knew it. Everywhere the effects were felt. The hardy country gentleman, who had sat down gladly to a meal of ale and beef, in a room designed perhaps by the brothers Adam, with classic dignity, now felt chilly. Rugs appeared, beards were grown, trousers were fastened tight under the instep. The chill which he felt in his legs the country gentleman soon transferred to his house. Furniture was muffled, walls and tables were covered, nothing was left bare. Then a change of diet became essential. The muffin was invented, and the crumpet. Coffee supplanted the after-dinner port, and as coffee led to a drawing-room in which to drink it, and a drawing-room to glass cases, and glass cases to artificial flowers, and artificial flowers to mantelpieces, and mantelpieces to pianofortes, and pianofortes to drawing-room ballads, and drawing-room ballads, skipping a stage or two, to innumerable little dogs, mats, and china ornaments, the home, which had become extremely important, was completely altered. Outside the house, it was another effect of the damp, ivy grew in unparalleled profusion. Houses that had been of bare stone were smothered in greenery. No garden, however formal its original design, lacked a shrubbery, a wilderness, a maze. What light penetrated to the bedrooms where children were born was naturally of an obfusc green, and what light penetrated to the drawing-rooms where grown men and women lived came through curtains of brown and purple plush. But the change did not stop at outward things. The damp struck within. Men felt the chill in their hearts, the damp in their minds. In a desperate effort to snuggle their feelings into some sort of warmth, one subterfuge was tried after another. Love, birth, and death were all swaddled in a variety of fine phrases. The sexes drew further and further apart. No open conversation was tolerated. Evasions and concealments were sedulously practised on both sides. And just as the ivy and the evergreen rioted in the damp earth outside, so did the same fertility show itself within. The life of the average woman was a succession of childbirths. She married at 19, and had 15 or 18 children by the time she was 30, for twins abounded. Thus the British Empire came into existence, and thus, for there is no stopping damp. It gets into the inkpot as it gets into the woodwork. Sentences swelled, adjectives multiplied, lyrics became epics, and little trifles that had been essays a column long were now encyclopedias in 10 or 20 volumes. But Eusebius Chubb shall be our witness to the effect this all had upon the mind of a sensitive man who could do nothing to stop it. There is a passage towards the end of his memoirs where he describes how, after writing 35 folio pages one morning, all about nothing, he screwed the lid of his inkpot and went for a turn in his garden. Soon he found himself involved in the shrubbery. Innumerable leaves creaked and glistened above his head. He seemed to himself to crush the mould of 1,000,000 more under his feet. Thick smoke exuded from a damp bonfire at the end of the garden. He reflected that no fire on earth could ever hope to consume that vast vegetable encumbrance. Wherever he looked, vegetation was rampant. Cucumbers came scrolloping across the grass to his feet. Giant cauliflowers towered deck above deck, till they rivalled, to his disordered imagination, the elm trees themselves. Hens laid incessantly eggs of no special tint. Then, remembering with a sigh his own fecundity, and his poor wife Jane, now in the throes of her 15th confinement indoors, how, he asked himself, could he blame the fowls? He looked upwards into the sky. Did not heaven itself, or that great frontispiece of heaven, which is the sky, indicate the ascent, indeed the instigation, of the heavenly hierarchy? For there, winter or summer, year in, year out, the clouds turned and tumbled, like whales, he pondered, or elephants rather. But no, there was no escaping the simile which was pressed upon him from 1,000 airy acres. The whole sky itself, as it spread wide above the British Isles, was nothing but a vast feather bed, and the undistinguished fecundity of the garden, the bedroom and the hen-roost, was copied there. He went indoors, wrote the passage quoted above, laid his head in a gas-oven, and when they found him later, he was past revival. While this went on in every part of England, it was all very well for Orlando to mew herself in her house at Blackfriars, and pretend that the climate was the same, that one could still say what one liked and wear knee-breeches or skirts as the fancy took one. Even she, at length, was forced to acknowledge that times were changed. One afternoon, in the early part of the century, she was driving through St. James's Park in her old panelled coach, when one of those sunbeams, which occasionally, though not often, managed to come to earth, struggled through, marbling the clouds with strange prismatic colours as it passed. Such a sight was sufficiently strange, after the clear and uniform skies of the 18th century, to cause her to pull the window down and look at it. The puce and flamingo clouds made her think, with a pleasurable anguish, which proves that she was insensibly afflicted with the damp already, of dolphins dying in Ionian seas. But what was her surprise when, as it struck the earth, the sunbeam seemed to call forth, or to light up, a pyramid, hecatomb, or trophy, for it had something of a banquet-table air. A conglomeration, at any rate, of the most heterogeneous and ill-assorted objects, piled higgledy-piggledy in a vast mound, where the statue of Queen Victoria now stands. Draped about a vast cross of fretted and florated gold were widow's weeds and bridal veils. Hooked onto other excrescences were crystal palaces, bassinets, military helmets, memorial wreaths, trousers, whiskers, wedding cakes, cannon, Christmas trees, telescopes, extinct monsters, globes, maps, elephants, and mathematical instruments, the whole supported like a gigantic coat of arms, on the right side by a female figure clothed in flowing white, on the left by a portly gentleman wearing a frock coat and sponge-bag trousers. The incongruity of the objects, the association of the fully clothed and the partly draped, the garishness of the different colours, and their plaid-like juxtapositions afflicted Orlando with the most profound dismay. She had never, in all her life, seen anything at once so indecent, so hideous, and so monumental. It might, and indeed it must be, the effect of the sun on the waterlogged air. It would vanish with the first breeze that blew. But for all that it looked, as she drove past, as if it were destined to endure for ever. Nothing, she felt, sinking back into the corner of her coach, no wind, rain, sun, or thunder could ever demolish that garish erection. Only the noses would mottle and the trumpets would rust, but there they would remain, pointing east, west, south, and north, eternally. She looked back as her coach swept up Constitution Hill. Yes, there it was, still beaming placidly in a light which, she pulled her watch out of her fob, was of course the light of 12 o'clock midday. None other could be so prosaic, so matter-of-fact, so impervious to any hint of dawn or sunset, so seemingly calculated to last forever. She was determined not to look again. Already she felt the tides of her blood run sluggishly. But what was more peculiar, a blush, vivid and singular, overspread her cheeks as she passed Buckingham Palace, and her eyes seemed forced by a superior power down upon her knees. Suddenly she saw with a start that she was wearing black breeches. She never ceased blushing till she had reached her country house, which, considering the time it takes 4 horses to trot 30 miles, will be taken, we hope, as a signal proof of her chastity. Once there, she followed what had now become the most imperious need of her nature, and wrapped herself as well as she could in a damask quilt, which she snatched from her bed. She explained to the widow Bartholomew, who had succeeded good old Grimsditch as housekeeper, that she felt chilly. "So do we all, my lady," said the widow, heaving a profound sigh. "The walls is sweating," she said, with a curious, lugubrious complacency. And sure enough, she had only to lay her hand on the oak panels for the fingerprints to be marked there. The ivy had grown so profusely that many windows were now sealed up. The kitchen was so dark that they could scarcely tell a kettle from a colander. A poor black cat had been mistaken for coals and shovelled on the fire. Most of the maids were already wearing 3 or 4 red flannel petticoats, though the month was August. "But is it true, my lady?" the good woman asked, hugging herself, while the golden crucifix heaved on her bosom, "that the Queen, bless her, is wearing what d'ye call it, the good woman hesitated and blushed. "A crinoline." Orlando helped her out with it, for the word had reached Blackfriars. Mrs. Bartholomew nodded. The tears were already running down her cheeks, but as she wept she smiled, for it was pleasant to weep. Were they not all of them weak women? Wearing crinolines the better to conceal the fact, the great fact, the only fact, but nevertheless the deplorable fact, which every modest woman did her best to deny until denial was impossible, the fact that she was about to bear a child, to bear 15 or 20 children indeed, so that most of a modest woman's life was spent, after all, in denying what, on one day at least of every year, was made obvious. "The muffins is keeping hot," said Mrs. Bartholomew, mopping up her tears, "in the library." And, wrapped in a damask bed-quilt, to a dish of muffins Orlando now sat down. "The muffins is keeping hot in the library." Orlando minced out the horrid Cockney phrase in Mrs. Bartholomew's refined Cockney accents as she drank. But no, she detested the mild fluid, her tea. It was in this very room, she remembered, that Queen Elizabeth had stood astride the fireplace with a flagon of beer in her hand, which she suddenly dashed on the table when Lord Burleigh tactlessly used the imperative instead of the subjunctive. "Little man, Orlando could hear her say, "is must a word to be addressed to princes?" And down came the flagon on the table. There was the mark of it still. But when Orlando leapt to her feet, As the mere thought of that great queen commanded, the bed-quilt tripped her up, and she fell back in her armchair with a curse. Tomorrow she would have to buy 20 yards or more of black bombazine, she supposed, to make a skirt. And then, here she blushed, she would have to buy a crinoline. And then, here she blushed, a bassinet, and then another crinoline, and so on. The blushes came and went with the most exquisite iteration of modesty and shame imaginable. One might see the spirit of the age blowing, now hot, now cold, upon her cheeks. And if the spirit of the age blew a little unequally, the crinoline being blushed for before the husband, her ambiguous position must excuse her. Even her sex was still in dispute, and the irregular life she had lived before. At length the colour on her cheeks resumed its stability, and it seemed as if the spirit of the age, if such indeed it were, lay dormant for a time. Then Orlando felt in the bosom of her shirt as if for some locket or relic of lost affection, and drew out no such thing, but a roll of paper, sea-stained, blood-stained, travel-stained, the manuscript of her poem, The Oak Tree. She had carried this about with her for so many years now, and in such hazardous circumstances, that many of the pages were stained, some were torn, while the straits she had been in for writing paper when with the gipsies had forced her to overscore the margins and cross the lines, till the manuscript looked like a piece of darning most conscientiously carried out. She turned back to the first page, and read the date, 1586, written in her own boyish hand. She had been working at it for close 300 years now. It was time to make an end. Meanwhile she began turning and dipping and reading and skipping and thinking as she read, how very little she had changed all these years. She had been a gloomy boy, in love with death, as boys are, and then she had been amorous and florid, and then she had been sprightly and satirical, and sometimes she had tried prose, and sometimes she had tried drama. Yet through all these changes she had remained, she reflected, fundamentally the same. She had the same brooding, meditative temper, the same love of animals and nature, the same passion for the country and the seasons. After all, she thought, getting up and going to the window, nothing has changed. The house, the garden, are precisely as they were. Not a chair has been moved, not a trinket sold. There are the same walks, the same lawns, the same trees, and the same pool, which, I dare say, has the same carp in it. True, Queen Victoria is on the throne, and not Queen Elizabeth, but what difference— No sooner had the thought taken shape than, as if to rebuke it, the door was flung wide, and in marched Basket, the butler, followed by Bartholomew, the housekeeper, to clear away tea. Orlando, who had just dipped her pen in the ink, and was about to indite some reflection upon the eternity of all things, was much annoyed to be impeded by a blot, which spread and meandered round her pen. It was some infirmity of the quill, she supposed. It was split or dirty. She dipped it again. The blot increased. She tried to go on with what she was saying. No words came. Next she began to decorate the blot with wings and whiskers, till it became a round-headed monster, something between a bat and a wombat. But as for writing poetry with Basket and Bartholomew in the room, it was impossible. No sooner had she said, impossible, than to her astonishment and alarm, the pen began to curve and caracole with the smoothest possible fluency. Her page was written in the neatest sloping Italian hand, with the most insipid verse she had ever read in her life. I am myself but a vile link, amid life's weary chain, but I have spoken hallowed words, oh, do not say in vain. Will the young maiden, when her tears alone in moonlight shine, tears for the absent and the loved, murmur? She wrote without a stop, as Bartholomew and Basket grunted and groaned about the room, mending the fire, picking up the muffins. Again she dipped her pen, and off it went. She was so changed, the soft carnation cloud, once mantling o'er her cheek like that which eve hangs over the sky, glowing with roseate hue, had faded into paleness, broken by bright, burning blushes, torches of the tomb. But here, by an abrupt movement, she spilt the ink over the page and blotted it from human sight, she hoped for ever. She was all of a quiver, all of a stew. Nothing more repulsive could be imagined than to feel the ink flowing thus in cascades of involuntary inspiration. What had happened to her? Was it the damp? Was it Bartholomew? Was it Basket? What was it? She demanded. But the room was empty. No one answered her, unless the dripping of the rain in the ivy could be taken for an answer. Meanwhile she became conscious, as she stood at the window, of an extraordinary tingling and vibration all over her, as if she were made of 1,000 wires, upon which some breeze or errant fingers were playing scales. Now her toes tingled, now her marrow. She had the queerest sensations about the thigh bones. Her hairs seemed to erect themselves. Her arms sang and twanged, as the telegraph wires would be singing and twanging in 20 years or so. But all this agitation seemed at length to concentrate in her hands, and then in one hand, and then in one finger of one hand, and finally to contract itself, so that it made a ring of quivering sensibility about the second finger of the left hand. And when she raised it to see what caused this agitation, she saw nothing, nothing but the vast solitary emerald which Queen Elizabeth had given her. And was that not enough? She asked. It was of the finest water. It was worth £10,000 at least. The vibration seemed, in the oddest way, but remember we are dealing with some of the darkest manifestations of the human soul, to say, no, that is not enough, and further to assume a note of interrogation, as though it were asking, what did it mean, this hiatus, this strange oversight, till poor Orlando felt positively ashamed of the second finger of her left hand, without in the least knowing why. At this moment Bartholomew came in to ask which dress she should lay out for dinner, and Orlando, whose senses were much quickened, instantly glanced at Bartholomew's left hand, and instantly perceived what she had never noticed before, a thick ring of rather jaundiced yellow circling the third finger where her own was bare. "Let me look at your ring, Bartholomew," she said, stretching her hand to take it. At this Bartholomew made as if she had been struck in the breast by a rogue. She started back a pace or two, clenched her hand, and flung it away from her with a gesture that was noble in the extreme. "No," she said, with resolute dignity. Her ladyship might look if she pleased, but as for taking off her wedding ring, not the Archbishop, nor the Pope, nor Queen Victoria on her throne could force her to do that. Her Thomas had put it on her finger 25 years, 6 months, 3 weeks ago. She had slept in it, worked in it, washed in it, prayed in it, and proposed to be buried in it. In fact, Orlando understood her to say, but her voice was much broken with emotion, that it was by the gleam on her wedding ring that she would be assigned her station among the angels, and its lustre would be tarnished for ever if she let it out of her keeping for a second. "Heaven help us," said Orlando, standing at the window and watching the pigeons at their pranks. "What a world we live in! What a world, to be sure!" Its complexities amazed her. It now seemed to her that the whole world was ringed with gold. She went in to dinner. Wedding rings abounded. She went to church. Wedding rings were everywhere. She drove out. Gold or pinchbeck, thin, thick, plain, smooth, they glowed dully on every hand. Rings filled the jewellers' shops, not the flashing pastes and diamonds of Orlando's recollection, but simple bands without a stone in them. At the same time she began to notice a new habit among the town people. In the old days one would meet a boy trifling with a girl under a hawthorn hedge frequently enough. Orlando had flicked many a couple with the tip of her whip, and laughed and passed on. Now all that was changed. Couples trudged and plodded in the middle of the road, indissolubly linked together. The woman's right hand was invariably passed through the man's left, and her fingers were firmly gripped by his. Often it was not till the horses' noses were on them that they budged, and then, though they moved, it was all in one piece, heavily, to the side of the road. Orlando could only suppose that some new discovery had been made about the race, that they were somehow stuck together, couple after couple, but who had made it, and when, she could not guess. It did not seem to be nature. She looked at the doves and the rabbits and the elk-hounds, and she could not see that nature had changed her ways or mended them since the time of Elizabeth at least. There was no indissoluble alliance among the brutes that she could see. Could it be Queen Victoria, then, or Lord Melbourne? Was it from them that the great discovery of marriage proceeded? Yet the Queen, she pondered, was said to be fond of dogs, and Lord Melbourne, she had heard, was said to be fond of women. It was strange. It was distasteful. Indeed, there was something in this indissolubility of bodies which was repugnant to her sense of decency and sanitation. Her ruminations, however, were accompanied by such a tingling and twanging of the afflicted finger that she could scarcely keep her ideas in order. They were languishing and ogling like a housemaid's fancies. They made her blush. There was nothing for it but to buy one of those ugly bands and wear it like the rest. This she did, slipping it, overcome with shame, upon her finger in the shadow of a curtain, but without avail. The tingling persisted more violently, more indignantly than ever. She did not sleep a wink that night. Next morning, when she took the pen up to write, either she could think of nothing, and the pen made one large lachrymose blot after another, or it ambled off, more alarmingly still, into mellifluous fluencies about early death and corruption, which were worse than no thinking at all. For it would seem, her case proved it, that we write not with the fingers, but with the whole person. The nerve which controls the pen winds itself about every fibre of our being, threads the heart, pierces the liver. Though the seat of her trouble seemed to be the left hand, she could feel herself poisoned through and through, and was forced at length to consider the most desperate of remedies, which was to yield completely and submissively to the spirit of the age, and take a husband. That this was much against her natural temperament has been sufficiently made plain. When the sound of the Archduke's chariot wheels died away, the cry that rose to her lips was, "Life, a lover!" not "Life, a husband." And it was in pursuit of this aim that she had gone to town and run about the world, as has been shown in the previous chapter. Such is the indomitable nature of the spirit of the age, however, that it batters down anyone who tries to make stand against it far more effectually than those who bend its own way. Orlando had inclined herself naturally to the Elizabethan spirit, to the Restoration spirit, to the spirit of the 18th century, and had, in consequence, scarcely been aware of the change from one age to the other. But the spirit of the 19th century was antipathetic to her in the extreme, and thus it took her and broke her, and she was aware of her defeat at its hands as she had never been before. For it is probable that the human spirit has its place in time assigned to it. Some are born of this age, some of that, and now that Orlando was grown a woman, a year or two past 30 indeed, the lines of her character were fixed, and to bend them the wrong way was intolerable. End of Section 13.